welcome. If you're new to osteoporosis, you're probably feeling a bit overwhelmed. Well, this presentation was made for you. What I'm going to cover today is an overview of all the things you need to know. The causes of osteoporosis, the required testing, the available treatments, and then finally choosing the right treatment that's tailored for you. As luck would have it, the 2025 World Congress on Osteoporosis just happened in April, and what I've done is I've incorporated all the latest information into this presentation. My name is Michael Lavico. I'm an engineer, I'm a researcher, and I'm a patient. I have osteoporosis. But what I'm not is a doctor. So the intent of this presentation is for you to take all of the learnings and to be able to work with your doctor to tailor a treatment that's best for you to reduce your risk of fracture. Okay. I have no disclosures. I don't work for any insurance company. I don't work for any pharmaceutical company. I don't get paid at all. All I'm doing is sharing what I've learned through my journey and hoping it helps you. And like I said, the World Congress on Osteoporosis just completed. This is the third year in a row that I've attended this. And here are some of the doctors that presented at this conference. And you'll see their names repeatedly on so many different trials. So it's great information straight from the people that are doing the testing on these drugs. So what is osteoporosis and how did I get it? Well, osteoporosis is simply the loss of bone mass and structure. And this picture here outlines it pretty well. If you look at the far left, that's more of a normal type of bone. And on the right, that's more of an osteoporotic bone. And what you see is a lot of the structure has been lost. These honeycombs are now bigger and the edges are thinner, the walls are thinner. And what that does is it weakens the bone and makes it more susceptible to fracture. Now the way this is measured is in a scale called T-score. It's not the best scale in the world, but there's a reason for it. The scores of -1 or better are considered normal. Between -1 and -2.5, you're at an increased risk of fracture. And if you're at -2.5 or worse, this is considered a high risk of fracture, also known as osteoporosis. Now, they couldn't just use a scale of 1 to 10, 5 being you're doing okay. But there is a reason for this scale. It's the number of standard deviations away from the average bone density of a 30-year-old female. Okay, so there's technical reason for it. Unfortunately, we're stuck with this scale. Most people get osteoporosis from just aging. It's part of the aging process. And if we look at this chart, you can see bone mass throughout our lives, right? From birth, you're growing, bones are getting bigger, bones are getting stronger. By about 30 years old, you've reached that peak. And then as you age beyond that, you lose bone mineral density. Now, if you look at the female there's a big drop when you enter something called menopause. And what I'm going to do is zoom in on that area because it's very important when we're talking about osteoporosis. So here's an example of two different women coming into menopause. One coming in at that average T-score of 0, coming into menopause, and then you see this sudden drop. And what happens is the ovaries stop producing estrogen, and estrogen is a key component to bone building. So you have this loss of bone density, very rapid, and then it levels off to this, declining slope into, trouble zone, right? The second woman, represented by the orange line, comes into menopause at -1. And what happens to her is she, again, loses bone mineral density from the loss of estrogen and then tapers down. And this female actually hit osteoporosis by about 64, 65 years old. And when you look at this, you think, boy, I sure wish there was a way we could get rid of that, sudden drop at menopause. And there is a way to do that. Now, the chart that you're looking at here are for women without hormone replacement therapy. So they haven't supplemented that lost estrogen. However, if you do supplement that lost estrogen, you can really flatten out the curve here. Now, I know a lot of you, when you go to talk to your doctor and your doctor says, oh, estrogen's bad, and if we supplement estrogen, it increases your risk of breast cancer. Well, that's not necessarily true. Now, there was something called the Women's Health Initiative in early 2000s, and sure enough, there was a group that had increased risk of breast cancer when they were 60 years old or older, that group. Now, that was a group that was using something called medroxyprogesterone acetate, or MPA, as a progestin, because you can't just take estrogen without a progestin if you still have your uterus. So there was a second group that didn't have a uterus and just used estrogen. That group, whether it's 50 to 60, 60 to 70, 70 years old or older, all of those groups had a reduction in the risk of breast cancer. So don't write off estrogen right away, because it's very good for bone. Okay, more about estrogen later. All right, so it's not just the loss of estrogen, or aging for that matter, that causes osteoporosis. There are a lot of other reasons, genetics being one of them, right? You should have picked better parents. Diseases, and there's some specific ones for osteoporosis, like hyperparathyroidism or hypercalciuria. And other diseases as well. Lack of nutrition and exercise, right? Maybe you didn't reach that peak because, you weren't getting enough calcium, you weren't getting enough vitamin D, or maybe you just weren't active enough, and, the activity helps build bones. So then when you hit menopause at that -1 mark, down you go to osteoporosis. And there's also a class of medications that can be hard on bones, and you'll lose bone density. The steroids are big on doing that. So you want to make sure you check and treat any secondary causes of osteoporosis so the medications will work better, assuming you have to take one. All right, so are you ready? All right, everyone goes through these 5 stages of grief when they find out they have osteoporosis. The first one is denial, right? Could have been a DEXA scan that you got a couple of years ago. Your doctor says you have osteopenia. You say, what's that? And then you tell them, oh, you're nuts. I work out. I'm in good shape. We'll just keep going and see what happens. And then maybe a year or 2 passes by, and now you get another DEXA scan done. And all of a sudden you're in osteoporosis, and you're like, oh man, this is no way. I'm doing everything that I should be doing, at least to your knowledge. And now, you've done enough research that you're actually a little bit afraid. Your doctor's telling you, hey, you better be careful. You better not fall. And all of a sudden you're, I don't even know what I'm going to do now, right? I'm afraid to leave the house. But at some point you're going to end up in this bargaining phase. And this bargaining phase is very important. You want to get here as quickly as you can, because this is where you're going to try to make a difference, right? Your doctor's going to say, hey, let's put you on this medication. And you're like, hey, wait a minute. I want to do some other stuff here first. Let's make sure I get enough calcium. I'll take 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium every day in my food and supplements. I'll get there to 1,500 or 1,200. And, let's make sure my vitamin D is in the right level, right? I could be low in vitamin D. Let's get it in that range that's optimum for building bone. You know what? I'm going to exercise. I know that, lifting weights and doing, weighted exercises help build bones. I'm going to do that. Now, you might think you're too afraid, right? Your doctor just told you might break something. Well, exercise is really important here, and not just for muscle, or not just for bone building, but for muscle strength, right? If you're falling, you want to be able to catch yourself, right? These are things that are going to help prevent fracture. And as a matter of fact, Elaine Henderson, who runs a support group for the Bone Health of and Osteoporosis Foundation, she has a support group where she will show you how to exercise. And it's a call that she has multiple times a month, and it's free, and it's Zoom, and it's great. And at the same time, you're going to get testing done, right? You're going to test for some of these secondary causes of osteoporosis. And these same tests will help you choose medications later on. And you know what? Maybe this is enough. And believe me, if calcium and vitamin D are way out of whack, you can build bone in this time frame. And maybe you get out of it. But a lot of people don't get out of it. And here comes the depression. But you know what? now you're ready, right? You've got everything set up. You've checked all the boxes. You're in a good position now to start a medication. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that required testing, looking for those secondary causes and looking for the appropriate medications to take moving forward. So I have a list of blood tests here and one urine test that you want to make sure you get done. I'm just going to go through these real quickly. Comprehensive metabolic panel, you're making sure your kidneys are working, your liver is working. This checks a lot of different minerals in your body. Complete blood count, right? Red blood count, white blood count, looking for those, maybe something's wrong there, secondary cause. You're getting your calcium checked, very important. Part of your bones is calcium. And something called ionized calcium, which is, when you see calcium, that's a total calcium. Ionized calcium is just the free element. So if it's not bound to anything like albumin, that's the calcium that gets used in your bones. So it's important to check that at least once to make sure you don't have something funny going on there. A lot of times they just approximate it, but it's good to get it checked once. Then you're going to get your vitamin D checked. And when you say, hey, check my vitamin D, 95% of the time what that means is this 25-OH vitamin D level. And this is what's called the storage form of vitamin D, and it's a very important number. But you also want to get checked at least once this 1,25-OH2 vitamin D. That's known as calcitriol. That's the active form of vitamin D that, again, your bones use and your gut uses and everything else uses to kind of control the flow of calcium. So get that checked. If nothing else, again, just once to make sure something funny is not going on in that area. I had something funny going on in there. I still have something funny going on in that area, but that's another story. Parathyroid hormones. So the parathyroid's located behind your thyroid glands. Controls bone, both remodeling and modeling of your bone. So PTH is very important to check, especially for secondary causes. Thyroid stimulating hormones. So your thyroid yourself, if you're hypo or hyperthyroid, that's going to cause problem that's hard on bones. Bones are also made of phosphorus. So you want to get your phosphate checked, right? You might have a low phosphate level and your bones aren't mineralizing properly. Then the next two are bone markers. So you might have heard of these before. I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of detail here. But there's two that are used most frequently is CTX and P1NP. And CTX is a marker that's in your blood that shows when bones are being dissolved. Your bones are constantly being dissolved and rebuilt, right? Repairing areas that need it, adding strength, doing whatever it can, typical maintenance type stuff that happens. And so the CTX measures how active your bones are being resolved. You might have heard the word osteoclast before, but it measures the activity of those critters. And P1NP is kind of the opposite. It measures how much your bones are rebuilding, laying down new bone material. That osteoblast, you might have heard that term before. And then finally, testosterone, if you're a male, right, free and total. You might not realize this if you're a man out there. Testosterone gets converted to estrogen, and estrogen is good for bones. So if you're low on one, you're low on the other, and you want to make sure you get that checked. Now, what I didn't put here is estrogen, though you probably should, especially if you're going to get hormone replacement therapy or consider that, because you're going to need a baseline to figure out kind of how your supplementation is going. And then finally, a 24-hour urine test for calcium. One of the big problems, secondary causes, is urinating out too much calcium. So you need to figure out what's going on there, and there's various things you can do about that. By the way, I have a couple other trainings. One is calcium and vitamin D, where I cover a lot of these secondary causes, so probably worthwhile to watch that if you haven't already. Okay, while you're doing all this, try to find, add someone to your team here that can help you. Try to look for an endocrinologist that specializes in osteoporosis. They're actually pretty tough to find. I live in Orange County, California, and I have to drive an hour down to San Diego to find a doctor that I felt was qualified for me. So Try to get that person on your team. You're going to save a lot of time. All right, so let's talk about some of the available treatments. And I purposely put here beyond calcium and vitamin D because those are treatments. If you're deficient in those areas, you can make a big difference. So that, again, that bargaining phase is very important. Start checking things off the list. And, you might be able to avoid some medications because, you know what, no one wants to take medications. All medications have side effects. So, do what you can before you, get kind of forced down this road of medications. All right, so I put the medications in kind of 3 different buckets here. The first one are called osteoanabolics. Osteo meaning bone, anabolics meaning builder or building. And that's what they do. So they increase bone volume and improves the structure of your bone. If we take a look at the picture of this bone, there's kind of the outside edges here. I'll kind of use my mouse. The outside edges here, and just inside the outside edge here, that's called cortical bone. And then inside is called trabecular bone. Okay, complicated terms, don't really care about that. The bottom line is what these medications are going to do is they're going to thicken those walls, right? They're going to start bridging some of those, connections that got broken as you aged, as you became more osteoporotic. So you'll build back some of that structure. The walls are getting thicker. You're adding strength. You're adding mass to the bone. And that's how this class of drugs works. You have Evenity, Tymlos, Forteo, and now since Forteo has come off its 10-year patent, there's a new one called Evenity, I guess. And all of these drugs work a little bit different than each other. So you'll see that later on when I'm showing you kind of the sequence of these drugs in examples. But kind of keep that in mind for now. Now I'm going to shift over to the anti-resorptives. So the anti-resorptives work differently. They increase the mineralization of existing bone. So again, if we look at our model, the webs really don't get much thicker. The edges don't really get much thicker. You don't really build back that structure. It just kind of makes it harder. And by making it harder, it's harder to break, and therefore you reduce your risk of fracture. Now, there's some downsides to that too. You might have heard of things called atypical femoral fractures, right? The bones become more brittle, more hard, but they also reduce the risk of fracture. So there are various drugs over here in this camp. Prolia is one of them. And then there's a second kind of subclass here called of bisphosphonates. Reclast, Fosamax, Actonel. There are others over here as well. These two kind of work differently. Prolia is very unique, and I'll show you that in a second. But Prolia is also believed to, actually it does kind of thicken some of those webs, at least to some extent, where the bisphosphonates don't. Okay, the last bucket here is the hormone replacement therapy. So hormone replacement therapy slows bone loss and can help regain some of the lost bone. So again, if you're early in menopause and you start using this estrogen, you can help prevent that need, slow that bone loss, right? My wife is at this period. This is what we're doing for her, and she plans on being on estrogen for the rest of her life. Smooth this out. With any luck at all, she'll never, know what osteoporosis is. Well, she has to because she's married to me. And those, okay, so if you are in menopause though, and past menopause, it could be 5 years, could be 10 years, could be 20 years. There are benefits to estrogen for rebuilding bone. I also attended the World Congress on Menopause last year. It was late last year. And everyone was very pro-estrogen, at least when it came to bone building. I think there's a lot of other positive side effects to estrogen, but we'll leave that for now. So there are two kind of groupings in this hormone replacement therapy. There's estrase, Climera, the dot, estrogel. These are what's called bioidentical estradiol. Might also be called 17-beta estradiol or E2. These are all the kind of the medical names for them. And they come in various forms. They come in pills, they come in patches, they come in sprays, they come in gels, right? A whole bunch of different ways that you can, get this into your body. And then there's a second class of estrogen, and this is kind of an older estrogen called Premarin. And this is conjugated equine estrogens. I guess it's made from horses or horse urine. It's kind of an older thing, but still used here in the U.S. Europe, best I can tell, is mostly just straight estradiol, where Premarin is being still used here in the U.S., though estradiol is picking up speed. If it's not more than half, I'd be surprised. Now, with either one of these estrogens, if you still have your uterus, you have to add a progestin. Now, you don't want to use what I talked about earlier, that medroxyprogesterone acetate, or MPA, right? They have found that, I've seen multiple studies where that seems to be causing these increased risks of various other diseases, right? You want to use the micronized bioidentical progesterone. It comes in a pill, right? It's the only form it comes in. And so use that, and with any luck at all, you'll see all the positive results that I'm going to show you. Now, I've got a little note over here on the side. Use osteoanabolics before anti-resorptives when possible for best results. And when you think about it, let's look back at our model here. The osteoanabolics, right? The osteoanabolics are going to add bone material. So, the web's going to get thicker. You're going to get, a better, tighter web. The outside edges are going to get thicker. And so you're adding bone mass to the bone, where the anti-resorptives, freeze the bone. Well, don't you want to add the mass kind of before you kind of harden it, right? If you go the other way around and you kind of harden it first and then try to use the osteoanabolics to build on that, they have a very difficult time doing that. You lose a lot of the effectiveness of the osteoanabolic. So again, start with the osteoanabolic, move to the anti-resorptives later in your treatment. Okay, and I'll show you some examples of that. All right, so I put together a chart, and this chart is based on the major clinical trials for each one of these drugs. So first we see, as an example, Evenity. Evenity is kind of the quickest acting, most powerful type of osteoanabolic drug. And you can see you pick up about 13.7% on average in the lumbar spine, 6.2% in the hip, all in 1 year. So this is a great drug if you're in that high risk, high fracture zone to kind of get out of it quickly, which is what you want to do before you break. Tymlos, also a very effective drug, 11.2%, 4.2%. Now this study was a year and a half, though you can take this for 2 years. Matter of fact, some people take it longer. They check these bone markers to see if it's still working. But regardless, very powerful drug. And it's a similar drug to Forteo. It's a newer drug than Forteo. But you can see Forteo is, gives you similar results. Which brings me to a question that got asked during the World Congress on Osteoporosis to Dr. Reginster. And someone asked him, hey, he was really talking about Tymlos, and someone said, hey, can you tell me a time where you would use Forteo over Tymlos? And he said, no, never. And then he corrected himself and said, well, if you can't get Tymlos and Forteo is the only thing available, then I would use Forteo. Now, I did find one other reason why you might want to use Forteo instead of Tymlos, but it has to do with combining drugs. And I'll show you a slide on that in the backup. And there was a doctor that explained that. I'll try to cover that. Okay, which takes us to Prolia. So Prolia, I've got it listed here twice because it's a very unique drug. It's a great drug to have available for us with osteoporosis. I'm actually on Prolia myself right now. And it's a very important drug. And you can see the performance that you get, 21.7% and 9.2%. That's in 10 years, right? 5 years, 13.7 and 7.0 in 5 years. So it's a drug like no other on this chart. You can take it for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 15, right? It continues to increase your bone mineral density and reduce the risk of fracture over time. So it's a wonderful drug, but it also has some downsides. And I have actually a whole separate presentation. I'm just now updating it for 2025 on Prolia. because it has some kind of catches to it. Again, upsides, downsides to every drug, and this one has one as well, and it has to do with something called the rebound effect when you try to transfer off of Prolia. Okay, and then the next two, Reclast and Fosamax, they're similar drugs, similar acting type of drugs. Reclast is more powerful, lasts longer in your system, and you can see the gains that you get from that in the 5-6 year time frame. Now, the hip, what's not shown here, and I have it in the backup, is the hip numbers really happen at about year 3 to year 4, and then they start going down. So you have to keep that in mind. These drugs are really only designed, the Reclast and Fosamax, to be used for a couple, 2-3 years, 4 years maybe, at a time, and I'll talk more about that. And then finally, the last one, estrogen. This was actually from it's a small trial, but the average age was 74 to 75 years old. And this was a really small dose of oral estradiol, right? The bioidentical stuff. And it was just 0.25 milligrams. To put this in perspective, my wife is taking 2 milligrams, right? 8 times as much. 8 times as much? 8 times as much. And they still saw great benefits of 5.3%, 2.7% in just 3 years. So don't write off estrogen quite yet. I call it the female superpower because it helps on so many different levels. Just a quick short story here. When my wife went into menopause, all of her lipid panel and insulin capability, insulin resistance type stuff, everything went to hell in a handbasket. Right? Before menopause, she was fantastic. Low LDL, high HDL, everything looked great. Then everything turned red. And slowly we went on estrogen. She started with the patch, she doubled the patch, quadrupled the patch, went to 1 milligram of oral before she made it to 2. And then by the time she hit 2, her numbers were back down to just about where they were before menopause. So from a heart perspective, a very good thing, as well as sleep and mental acuity and a whole bunch of other things. Maybe even preventing Alzheimer's, so we'll see. Okay, I will move on. That chart's going to come in handy though. All right, so let's talk about choosing the right treatment for you. And there's lots of different factors here that influence which drug you're going to take. You're not just going to, just give me the best and I'll stay on as long as I can. No, you can't really do that. What you need to do is look at your current T-scores at your spine and your hip, because these medications work differently depending on which drug you're using. And depending on where you start will determine, kind of really classify what drug you're going to start on. And I'll show you examples. Have you had any prior treatments? If you've done a drug before, the next drug that follows it might or might not work as well. Matter of fact, some are detrimental, and I'll show you an example of that. Do you have prior fractures? If you've had a prior fracture before you start treatment, you're probably going to want to go further into kind of what I call a safe zone. Stay on the medication longer to help prevent fractures, because if you've had a prior fracture, the odds of you fracturing again are quite a bit higher than someone that hasn't fractured. Your age makes a difference. If you're older in age, something like Prolia you don't have to worry about transferring off of. That might influence your choice of drug. Future activity level. If you plan on being very active, you want to have a more aggressive target, right? A better T-score. Kidney function. If you have low kidney function, bisphosphonates aren't that great for you, right? If you're below 30 eGFR, they say, you really shouldn't use a bisphosphonate. Cardiovascular risk. Some of these carry an increased cardiovascular risk. And then finally, secondary causes. And this was an influence for me. That's one of the reasons why I didn't choose Tymlos or Forteo for my first treatment, is because I still have hypercalciuria, where I urinate out too much calcium, and those drugs can make that worse, as an example. All right, but why are we doing all this? It's to help reduce the risk of fracture, right? We're trying to live the rest of our life without fracture, and that's why we're going down this medication path. All right, so this is a chart or picture that I built upon Dr. Michael McClung's chart that he pitched back in 2023, and then he updated it just last April. So I've built upon that. And what it shows is kind of this, what your risk is based on T-score, right? Risk of fracture. And I've got it categorized here 4 different ways. If you're above -3, and this is generally accepted as the high risk zone, okay? So if your bone density is worse than -3, you're at a very high risk, and you want to get out of the zone as quickly as possible. So you want to move to the fast-acting drugs that build back that structure, right? Add that, thicken those walls. And that would be your Evenity, Tymlos, and or Forteo. Now, I've got Prolia in brackets here because you really want to go with this osteoanabolic first, right? You want to drive this, get out of this high-risk zone very quickly. But if you can't get one of those 3 drugs, then Prolia really, is your last choice here, right, to get down there, because it's the only other drug that's going to get you down over time. And likewise, even if you're at -2.5 to -3, Evenity, Tymlos, Forteo, build back that lost structure. You've lost a lot of structure. Let's try to build some of that back before we move to kind of those hardening type of drugs. Now, Fosamax and Reclast, yeah, if you're at like -2.5, maybe -2.6, those might be an okay drug to take because you can get into this safe zone of below or you're better than -2.0. And while I'm talking about that, I guess I should explain this earlier. A lot of the doctors, when they're presenting, they have to come up with a target. Well, they don't have to, but they generally try to come up with a target. And they say, you know what, -2 is a pretty good target. It reduces your risk of fracture to a point that's kind of acceptable in a sense, right? Though you can still fracture here for sure, but you have diminishing returns on driving your T-score better than -2. So that's kind of a target that they look to kind of try to stay under. And going back, so Fosamax and Reclast, right? If you're just above that -2.5, you could get into this range kind of safely and then transition into this kind of maintenance mode that I'll explain in a second. If you can't get those 2 drugs, or maybe you're at something higher than that, like -2.8, 2.9, and you can't get Evenity, Tymlos, and Forteo, again, Prolia would be your choice there. Now, if you're in this medium range, right, you're not even at osteoporosis yet, and you're in what's called osteopenia range. Fosamax, Reclast, maybe even estrogen would be enough to kind of push you down into this lower risk zone. But maybe you've been on those drugs, right? Maybe you are already taking estrogen and you've been on Fosamax, you've been on Reclast, maybe you've been on them for too long, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, and you know what, your bone density is going the wrong way. Prolia might be the right choice here and take it for 5 years or even longer to drive yourself down into this low zone. And then finally, if you're lucky enough, right, to be in this low zone, we're trying to live this dream with my wife, right? We're going to try to just keep her in this low zone. So now you see these kind of 3 bars at the bottom. These are 3 various options. You might choose one over the other for various reasons. But we're going to stick with the bioidentical estrogen that our body used to make. That's the choice that we're making. And you know what? With any luck at all, she won't even leave this -2.0 zone. And so that's the plan until something goes wrong. But there are other options, and Mike McClung explained these. And this new line here that shows Reclast being used every 5 years, he got this from a new clinical trial that just finished this year, 2025. And I'm going to show you the results of that. But the net from that study, that clinical trial, was if you do Reclast just once every 5 years, you're able to maintain your bone density and also that structure, for a long period of time. Now, this trial was 10 years, but the hope is that you'll be able to continue this throughout your life. But I know it's a big leap of faith, right? If you're not above this -2 or even -2.5 for that matter, right? If you're not worse than that, it's tough to take a drug, right? They have side effects. But if you were convinced to do that, and that's what the study did, they found people that weren't in osteoporosis yet, and it kept them out of it. So that is an option. And now this middle one is, for whatever reasons, you decide, you freak out on estrogen, you hit age 65, maybe you're going to transition. You have to transition off of estrogen to another drug, because otherwise you're going to see that knee again, right? And that's why he's showing here, maybe what you do is if you're going to stop estrogen, you do just 2 years of Fosamax, right? Just allow your bones to kind of, settle in, kind of harden that structure that you've built up with estrogen. And then you take 3 years off, right? Let your bones recuperate, reheal, right? And fix some micro fractures and, do its thing like it's supposed to. And then you go back on drug, right? And, kind of harden things back up again. Okay, now I'm going to show you a couple of other type of examples where, maybe if you're in this very high risk zone, Evenity is not going to get you down in that low zone. You're going to have to do something else afterwards, right? Or Tymlos for that matter. So I'm going to show you examples of that. But before I do, let's talk about the hip. Oh, I forgot to tell you. When you were using this chart on the right-hand side, you see the spine numbers, right? The percentage increase for the trial years. 10 to 15% is about 1 T-score. So you can see that let's say we're at minus 3.5. Well, even if you could get a full T-score from Evenity, you're only going to be down to minus 2.5, right? So you're still going to have to do something after that. And you know what? Bisphosphonates probably aren't going to do the trick for you. So you're going to have to, do more work here, and I'll show you some examples. Okay, let's talk about the hip. So the hip is even tougher. And if we look at our chart over here, you see lower gains to begin with in the trials. And then on top of that, 10% is only equal to about a half a T-score. So the hip is mostly this cortical hard bone, and it's very difficult to move with all of the various drugs. So if you have osteoporosis in the hip, you're going to have a tougher time, and you're going to see that in some of the examples. But now you see some of our options have disappeared, right? If you're at minus 2.5, you're never going to get below minus 2 or better than minus 2 with Reclast or Fosamax. They run out of gas, right? You'll be lucky to get down to minus 2.2 with those drugs. And then even if you did, when you go on holiday, right, when you take a break after 3 years or 5 years even, you're going to get worse, and you're going to be pushing that osteoporosis again. So we've lost that option above minus 2.5. Really drive for Evenity, Tymlos, Forteo, or Prolia if you can't get any of those drugs. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at some examples. All right, now this is, I'll say, fairly common, right? You find out you have osteoporosis, then you hesitate, you're in the bargaining phase, you do a bunch of stuff. Next thing you know, you're at minus 2.8. In the lumbar spine, which is typically the worst of the bunch because it moves quicker than the hip does. And maybe you choose Tymlos, right? You use Tymlos for 2 years. We look at our performance. We say, okay, 11.2% in a year and a half. Maybe we get to 12 or, maybe even 13%. I don't think it's quite that much in 2 years. But regardless, we pick up, almost a full T-score, right? Maybe 0.8 T-score. And that's going to be low enough for us to transition to Fosamax. And when you transition Tymlos to Fosamax, you get the full effect of Fosamax, and it just builds right on top of it, and that drives you down into this, better than minus 2.0 zone, far enough for you to take what's called a holiday, right? You can stop taking anything for, a couple, 3 years. Now you're checking your T-score during this period, and if it goes up to minus 2 early, then you want to, hit it again with Fosamax for a couple of years. But you know what? Maybe it's 4 years, maybe it's 5 years before you need to do that. So this is where, things change. After each treatment, right before you finish, get your T-score checked to see where you're at, because that T-score number is going to determine kind of what your next step is. Right. So that's how this works. And oh, by the way, if you're on a drug like Tymlos or Forteo or Evenity for that matter, working out, lifting weights and stuff only helps it. It only magnifies the effect of the drug. So be sure to do that when you're on treatment. Don't be afraid to work out, but do it safely. Elaine Henderson can show you how to do that. Okay. Now, we could easily replace this Tymlos with Evenity, right? And in a year, we can even get more gains than what's shown here, and then we can transition to Fosamax. So that's another option. But if your hip isn't in that bad a shape, Tymlos, fantastic drug. Again, Tymlos is probably better than Forteo. It is across the board, it looks like, at least from a performance standpoint, and side effects are very similar. So regardless of the path, this is a nice thing, right? The nice thing to do here. Okay, now let's crank it up a bit here, right? Let's go to minus 3.5. So now we're at this very high risk of fracture. We're deep into osteoporosis. And you know what? Let's start with Evenity. This is kind of this is the path I took, by the way. I thought I was at minus 3.8 when I started. It turns out because of DEXA scan errors, I was at minus 3.2. Regardless, I went from Evenity and then I transitioned to Prolia. This is basically what I'm doing. And what you can see is in 1 year, you can drive almost, a full T-score. So that's pretty good, about 0.8 T-score. And then when you go to Prolia, I put like a little bump here because at first there's a greater effect and then it kind of flattens out after that. But you can see we could get below osteoporosis from minus 3.5 to below minus 2.5 in about a year and a half. So that feels really good, right? And I happen to be out. I've been on Prolia for 18 months. And I'm out of the osteoporosis range, so I'm pretty excited about that. But of course, I need to drive it down further because I want to reduce my risk of fracture, and I'll probably be on it for 10 years, like shown here. But regardless, this is one solution that you can do here. And you want to monitor your T-score, and when you get down to about minus 1.5, you can now transition. Now, if you're 80 years old at this point, maybe just stay on Prolia. But if you're still young, you're just hitting 70, which is where I'll be, maybe it makes sense for me to transition to Reclast. Now, Prolia this is kind of where things get special with Prolia. And if you plan on taking Prolia or if you're on Prolia, I highly, highly, highly recommend you watch my Prolia training because it's going to explain some of these ins and outs and how to, when to choose Prolia and how to get off of Prolia if you have to get off of Prolia. So hear me now, believe me when you watch the video, this is very important, this transition. And you can see I have Reclast here, and okay, we're going to take Reclast after Prolia. Guess what happens? You still lose bone density. And that's why I've driven this all the way down to minus 1.5 before transitioning to Reclast, because you will lose bone density when you've been on Prolia this long of a time. And then so maybe you take Reclast just 1 year, right? And then you're going to take a break. You're going to go off a drug and you're going to watch the T-score and see what happens. And when that T-score approaches minus 2, you're going to go back on Reclast, right? Drive it back down. And then this is going to be your cycle, maybe until you're done. Okay. All right, so that's another example. Let's look at this a different way. Let's try a different approach. Let's use Tymlos first and then Evenity. So what we're going to do is we're going to do 2 osteoanabolics. Now, could I have done Evenity first? Sure, but there was a new study, came out late last year, and I'm going to show you that in the backup material, where the order matters here, where Tymlos before Evenity seems to give a better result than Evenity followed by Tymlos. Okay, so that's why even though Tymlos, you're in this very high risk, it's not going to move as quickly as Evenity, but when you add them both together, you're going to be able to move further down this line here. And so here we are at minus 3.5. We get down below minus 2 in about 2.5 years, 2.5 to 3 years. That's outstanding, right? And then on top of that, we can transition to Fosamax instead of, say, Reclast. And that gives us more options down the road. Remember, Fosamax isn't as powerful. And if we had to do like something else, like another round of Evenity as an example, we could do that more easily being on Fosamax. So this is a great option here. Other options might be Evenity followed by Fosamax followed by Evenity. That might be another solution. Or for that matter, Tymlos followed by Fosamax followed by, Evenity or Tymlos or something else. But Evenity, if you're going to use a drug first, Evenity seems to work the best following any drug. Now, following Prolia is really tough, and again, you want to watch the Prolia presentation for something like that. Okay, so here's another example, and you could shift this up, right? If you're at minus, well, matter of fact, I think I'd do that. Look at that. All right, let's look at an example where you're -4. -4 in the lumbar spine, right? You're very high risk of fracture. Don't fall at this point, but continue to work out. So I'm going to start with Tymlos. I'm going to move to Evenity, just like the last one. But you know what? Fosamax isn't going to cut it. Reclast isn't going to cut it. I really have to move to Prolia to drive this down. Now, again, I could maybe do Fosamax for a year or two and then do Evenity again, right? That's an option. But for the most part, people will transition to Prolia and then stay on it. In this case, what is that, 6 years? And then transition to Reclast, right? And then you're back on path to what I showed you before. So if you are at these kind of, really poor, worse than -4 type of levels, actually worse than -3.5 levels, this looks like a pretty sound path. Now, I will tell you that the trials I'm basing this on is Forteo followed by Evenity, but there aren't trials for Tymlos followed by Evenity, at least not that I've seen. Though Tymlos is a better working drug, this should work out better. But just know that there aren't trials showing this combination, so it's a little bit of a leap of faith here. All right. And by the way, I put footnotes on all these slides so you can look up these trials yourself, and I highly recommend it to see kind of what the performance is and how these drugs transition from one drug to another. All right, so now here comes some kind of bad news, especially if you have osteoporosis in the hip. The hip is very difficult to move, and what I'm going to show you is kind of a repeat of some of those earlier plans we used for the spine, so you can see what they will do in the hip. And let's start as an example at -2.5 in the hip. So you're just in that osteoporosis range. Well, a year of Evenity, gets you about halfway down into this zone here, trying to reach -2. And then it takes another couple of years before you're going to reach -2 on Prolia. And then you can continue to take Prolia long enough so you can, compensate for this rebound effect, right? You're going to go on to Reclast, you're going to lose some bone density, but you're going to stay below this -2.0 line and hopefully be able to go on this maintenance mode. Okay. Likewise, that Tymlos Evenity thing that worked so well and so quickly in the spine doesn't work that well in the hip. So again, the hip is more difficult to move, and you might end up on Prolia regardless of what you do if your hip score is worse than -2.5. Okay, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a good thing that we actually have that option. And again, Prolia, unlike the bisphosphonates, seems to increase that bone thickness, that web thickness, at least to some extent over time. All right, now I know that was a lot of material. This is the bulk of the presentation that I wanted to cover has been done. I have a whole bunch of fun backup slides that I'm going to go through. So if you want to take a break, this would be a good time to do it. And feel free to post any questions. I answer all the questions that I see online. So if I don't, ping me again, and I'll try to get to them, or leave any comments. Love the comments. And again, Elaine Henderson's Bone Buddies support group, it's part of the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation. If you go to their website, you'll find this support group, and here's Elaine's email address. And she's great in that she shows you, how to exercise safely, right? How to build muscle, to build, back strength in your bones and not hurt yourself. Very important. And the flexibility. If you can turn to catch yourself before you fall, odds are you're not going to break something. So I highly recommend Elaine. This is a support group I went to almost 3 years ago now. And I've been participating ever since. As a matter of fact, on the 4th Saturday of every month, we do kind of an open forum. It's Zoom, so we can see each other, talk to each other, and I try to answer any question that I can that comes up during that period of time. So if you want to talk personally, we can do that as well. All right, so some more fun stuff here. This was a slide this is a picture of the presentation that Dr. Michael McClung did. And this is where I basically stole his drawing, again, showing two different women at two different T-scores entering menopause, and how you are likely to hit osteoporosis if you enter that menopause point at a -1 T-score. This was that study that I was talking about where it took 10 years to do. And what they did is they took people that weren't, they were osteopenia, right? They weren't in osteoporosis range yet. And the idea was, what can we do to keep them out of osteoporosis? And that's what you see here. So let's start the lumbar spine. Year 0, they did it there's 3 groups, okay? One group was placebo, right? They got an infusion of saline or something to that effect, candy. I don't know what they put in those things. So they got an infusion that's a placebo, and they lost bone over the 10-year period, right? Then there was a second group that only got 1 infusion. So 1 infusion at year 0 of Reclast, and they gained bone mineral in the spine. And even though they didn't get another infusion at this point, they were still able to maintain their bone density for that 10-year period. So they didn't lose any bone density. They likely didn't lose any structure or much of any structure. So that's all a good thing. Sorry, let me make it so my mouse doesn't disappear here. Okay. So that's a good thing. Now this third group, they had an infusion at year 0 and an infusion at year 5. And you can see what happened was they gained again in the spine and maintained that gain for 10 years. So this is that thought where, oh shoot, maybe I could just do an infusion once every 5 years and maintain my structure and bone density and reduce my risk of fracture. And between those 5 years, right, it gives your bones a chance to kind of heal and fix some cracks and fractures and stuff like that and do what they're supposed to do. Now over here in the hip, it's a little bit different because the hip is tougher, right? So we didn't gain as much with 1 infusion, and if you didn't do a second infusion, you lost, and you're worse off than you were 10 years ago. But not bad at all. But if you got an infusion every 5 years, you were able to maintain that bone mineral density and most of your structure at the same time. So this was really exciting. I can tell you, all the doctors are like, ooh, you can see the study, right? 10-year studies, right? It takes a long time. And at the same time, you say, okay, well, that's great, Mike, but what about the risk of fracture? Do we reduce the risk of fracture? All these drugs reduce the risk of fracture, and we can see that here as well. So here's placebo. This is the risk of fracture. I think it's over the 10-year period. 12% of women fractured on placebo, whereas people on Reclast, 1 infusion, whether it was 1 infusion or 2 infusions, there was about the same reduction in fracture risk, about 40%, 45% reduction in risk of fracture. These don't eliminate your chances of fracture, right? Just reduce the risk of fracture. Okay. Here's another study that, again, I alluded to earlier. It just came out late last year. And it shows sequential treatment of osteoanabolics. In this case, it's Forteo and Evenity. So if we look at the blue line, right, the blue line is Evenity after Forteo treatment. So you've been on Forteo for 2 years, and now you're going to transition to Evenity. How do you do, right? Well, Evenity after Forteo, they were still able to gain in that 1 year period 10.8%, not the 13.7% that we saw on an earlier slide, but 10.8% is pretty darn good. Whereas if you flip it and you did Evenity first and then went to Forteo second, this is what you saw in that first year. Now Forteo is a 2-year drug, and maybe this would have pulled up, but still, we really saw a negligible effect in the lumbar spine on that Forteo following Evenity. So again, that order matters. And yes, I replaced it with Tymlos because Tymlos is a more effective drug overall. And likely a lot of this is going to hold. So Tymlos followed by Evenity makes a lot of sense. At least it does to me. Okay, they haven't had trials yet, so when they do, I'll update this. Now, same type of thing in the hip, but now Tymlos, you're actually losing a couple percent, right, or 1.3%. And again, the second year, more than likely, it's going to bounce back. That happens a lot with Forteo in particular. Tymlos has less of this kind of negative effect. And the same type of thing in the femoral neck. So again, you don't see the same gains on Evenity as someone that hasn't been on any treatment, but you know what? It's pretty darn good. Okay. Now, Dr. Letter presented this, which is really funny because it was his study that he was presenting on, from almost 10 years ago, or almost exactly 10 years ago. And again, this was talking about, okay, which drugs do I take in which order and such. And this was a really good example that he did. And it was called the data switch study, where they took one group of people and they put them on Prolia. So they put them on Prolia for 2 years. And they put another group on Forteo for 2 years. So you see the Prolia guys, they gained and did really well in the first 2 years. And then they switched to Forteo. And what happened was in the hip, they actually lost virtually everything they gained in the first, over that first 2 years, they lost in 1 year. And then again, like I said, it starts to recover. And you see that start to pull up here. Where if you do it the other way around, you do Forteo first, right? Yeah, it takes a little bit to get going. And then you switch, Prolia takes off, right? And the idea is Forteo has been building the structure inside. Forteo is very effective at building that trabecular bone inside, the web structure and such. And then when you hit it with Prolia to kind of harden things up, your bone mineral density goes up really high. And fracture risk goes down. So that's the right way to do this. As a matter of fact, someone asked him, hey, is Forteo following Prolia looks pretty bad. Is it worse than just stopping Prolia, which you don't want to do? Watch the Prolia presentation. Never stop Prolia without going to another drug. But don't use Forteo, right? Tymlos would likely be much better here, but you don't even want to use Tymlos. Don't use a PTH thing because it adds to CTX. It's a bad thing. Just don't do that. And again, watch the Prolia presentation. But so again, he said, boy, it might be worse. I don't know because we're not going to do any trials like that and bust people's bones on purpose. But it's not the way you want to order things. So if you're on Prolia, do not move to Forteo and likely don't move to Tymlos for the same reasoning. Okay, that said, you do have an option here, which is kind of cool. And Dr. Letter was asked about this too. I'll get to that in a second. This was a trial that he did, again, showing the effects of Forteo alone, Prolia alone, and then another group that did Prolia and Forteo at the same time. So this is kind of piggybacking two drugs at the same time. And what you saw was, boy, it was better across the board. And as a matter of fact, there's a chart that's not shown here, which is the distal 1/3 radius, right? Your wrist area. And the wrist area was significantly higher than either Prolia or Forteo alone. So you see this additive effect. And then someone asked him, he says, well, shoot, if someone's been on Prolia, you say you can't transition to Forteo or shouldn't. And he says, yeah, don't do that. But what you could do is instead of transitioning off of Prolia, right, because you need, maybe you fractured or something, you want to do something, just add Forteo on top of Prolia. Take them at the same time, and you could see a boost in your, bone building and add strength and structure. Now, this trial wasn't big enough to say that it adds strength, but logic and increased bone mineral density says it will. So that was his recommendation. Just stay on Prolia and add Forteo for a couple of years and, get a boost from that. And as a matter of fact, there was another study that was presented at the World Congress on Osteoporosis this year where they had Prolia going and they added Evenity and they saw a blip. An addition of this P1 and P marker that looked very positive, and that was yet another thing that you could do. But regardless, this is the only one that's gone to a trial of a larger extent to make sure that this works. So that could be an option for you, which is a nice option to have, right? Because maybe you're a real high risk and your doctor just started you on Prolia and didn't even consider the osteoanabolics. Well, it's not too late to just kind of add in a kicker. And as a matter of fact, this is the one case that I said earlier where you probably want to use Forteo. And someone asked him this as well. He says, well, what about adding Tymlos to Prolia instead of Forteo? And he said, you know what? I think Forteo is going to work better. And it has to do with the CTX and P1 and P markers because the P1NP is considerably higher on Forteo than it is on Tymlos. It gets a little technical, but if you want me to explain it, maybe I can, do that on a Saturday. Okay. All right, which takes me to this slide. This is Dr. Ferrari. He showed a couple different things here on the left-hand side, again, showing that fracture risk reduction as you're being treated, in this case on Prolia. And, you can see this flattening of the curve. And he's saying, maybe the zone here looks like a comfortable zone, but you know what, -2, it's starting to flatten at -2. That's a good target because, again, you have these diminishing returns. And it didn't really matter whether you were above 75 or less than 75. And on the right-hand side, he was trying to show why you need to go further if you've had a prior fracture. If you've had a prior fracture, more than likely your architecture doesn't look so good, that inside structure doesn't look so good, and you're going to be at a higher risk of an additional fracture. And that's what they saw during the trial, was even though people had the same bone mineral density, say -2, you are a lot higher risk of fracture if you've had a prior fracture than the group that didn't have a prior fracture. So again, you want to drive down lower if you've had a prior fracture. All right, Dr. Reginster presented this. He was showing, if you're in that high-risk zone, the effects that you get of using Evenity before Prolia versus Prolia alone. And you can see the time periods and how much quicker you can move. But the right-hand side caught my eye, and I've seen charts like this before, and I wanted to talk to it. Because you see these trials where people will gain bone mineral density on placebo. And sure enough, it's shown here, right? This group here on the right-hand side saw an increase in lumbar spine bone density, even though they were on placebo, right? They were getting shots of saline, once a month, and they increased bone mineral density. How can that be? Well, think about it. Before you enter any clinical trial, they'll ensure that you're taking 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium every day, right? They start you on this new regimen. And if your vitamin D levels are low, which really helps for building bones if it's in the right area, not too high, not too low, but if it's too low and or too high, they'll adjust your dosage to get you in this range. If you're low, they'll give you these big doses of vitamin D for a couple weeks and then bring you back down to, say, 1,000 to 2,000 IUs a day to keep you in that sweet spot zone. And then you start the trial. Well, guess what? That, almost proves the effectiveness of vitamin D and calcium, right? Once you get those balanced, and if you're way off, these can make a big difference. And people are gaining 10% bone mineral density in 1 year, right? That's, more than a half a T-score in 1 year. So that's pretty spectacular. Now, it's even echoed on the right-hand side here. So if you look at the Evenity, romosozumab is the technical name for it. So we look at Evenity. Well, guess what? There are people that had 30% increase in 1 year in their lumbar spine. That's like 2 T-scores or even over 2 T-scores. And you think, God, how can that possibly be? Well, again, if you have someone coming into this trial that was deficient in vitamin D and calcium, well, they're going to have an additive effect, and it shows really well here. Now, likewise, if you look at the left here, placebo patients that lose bone density, you kind of expect that, and maybe they already had correct vitamin D levels, and they already had correct calcium intake, and maybe they were working out, and there was nothing more they can do except for lose bone, right? Where on the left-hand side, yeah, there's some people that actually didn't respond. 1% of patients didn't respond, and guess what? Now, these are the people that said, okay, just give me the shot every month, and they're not adding their calcium, right? They're not adding their vitamin D. They're not doing the things they're supposed to for the trial would help explain that, right? For the most part, these drugs are very effective if you follow directions. So again, just an interesting example. All right, the next slides here, I put them in here really for your reference. I use these constantly. They're hard to find, and it's nice to have them in one place. By the way, if you read the description, I'll put a link to these slides. So you can download the PDF, you can print whatever ones you want, have at it. If you have any questions, let me know. So anyway, these are the major clinical trials that show the performance that you get, or that they got on the clinical trial. And on the right-hand side, it shows the bone markers. Now, I'm not going to get into bone markers. Should have a whole separate class on bone markers. They are important. They help you calculate. Now, I talk about them a little bit more on the Prolia presentation, because you really need to look at those bone markers when you transition from drug to drug. But these are real nice, handy references to have. So I put these in here. So this is Evenity. This is Forteo and Tymlos. They actually had a clinical trial, that 18-month one. You can take it for 2 years, but this trial was 18 months. And it shows the two head-to-head, so you can see how they compare. And you can see how the bone markers are kind of different over here and how they work. Tymlos is a newer drug. It's a more optimized drug. And across the board, it just beats Forteo. At least it seems to. Here's Prolia. Again, you're not going to see another chart like this where just year after year after year after year, you just continue to gain bone mineral density. And again, bisphosphonates don't do this. Evenity doesn't do this. Prolia doesn't do this. Tymlos doesn't do this, right? Prolia does it, sorry. Forteo doesn't do this, right? This is a wonderful drug to have, especially when you're at those real high risk fracture rates, right? And you see that both in the hip and the spine. And then some bone markers over here that I talk about in the Prolia presentation. So if you want to get into bone markers and know what's going on over here, watch that one. Now the next two are bisphosphonates, Reclast and Fosamax. And these two, if your doctor is recommending you go on these, you probably want to print these out and put them in front of your doctor to say, hey, if I'm at -3, let's say in the hip, you'll never see -2.5 on these drugs. Because what happens is in the hip, it peaks out at about 4.3% gain, which is about a quarter of a T-score. It's not much at all. You might go from -3 to -2.8. right? You'll never get out of the osteoporosis range. So this is not the drug you want to go on. Now, I know insurance companies say, well, you got to try the cheap stuff first. You say, no, that's old school thinking. Have your doctor write a letter. It's only going to slow down the effectiveness of your osteoanabolic that you should be on. Okay, so these are really important slides. This one here, and then this is by the way, the link's at the bottom too if you want to download them and read them. You can do that. And the same type of thing in the hip here for alendronate. Now, Fosamax, you can continue to build even up to 10 years, but again, you really don't want to because your hip starts going, the wrong direction when you're on drug, or it stops and, it starts to tailor off. And again, then you start running into these things called atypical femur fractures and femoral fractures and such. And you might have heard of things like osteonecrosis of the jaw and stuff like that. I talked some about this in the Prolia presentation for people on Prolia. Okay, let's wrap this up. I know you feel overwhelmed, and you might even feel more overwhelmed now that we've gone through this. And I know, because I know it was a lot of information to digest, and you might want to take this in bits and pieces. And when I see a training like this, I listen to it multiple times on my bike rides, and then I sit down and watch it and try to understand it and digest it. But hopefully you can use this information as a foundation to discuss your treatment with your doctor, right? Your doctor isn't going to know the latest, greatest, right? I'm retired. I can do this type of stuff. They're not. They're working full time. So you'll be educating your doctor to some extent here. So with that said, thank you for your time. I wish you the best of luck for your treatment. Stay fracture free.